An eventful beginning to the Republican National Convention. Trump has officially been chosen by the delegates as the party's presidential nominee, and he has officially selected his VP. It's Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Vance is expected to be formally nominated any moment now. President Joe Biden's campaign putting out a statement on Trump's selection, which reads in part, quote, Donald Trump picked J.D. Vance as his running mate because Vance will do what Mike Pence would not do on January 6th, bend over backward to enable Trump and his extreme MAGA agenda, even if it means breaking the law, and no matter the harm to the American people, end quote. Today's development set against the tragic backdrop of an attempted assassination on Saturday, an attack that is being investigated as an act of domestic terrorism. Saturday's shooting left one person dead and two others critically injured. We condemn what took place in the strongest terms possible. Violence has no place in our political discourse or in our politics. It's a pivotal moment in America's history where the stakes of the November election have never been higher or clearer. And it's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News national and political correspondent Jacob Soboroff is with us. He's in Milwaukee on the floor of the Republican National Convention. With us at the table, Democratic strategist, professor at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smikle, New York Times editorial board member, MSNBC political analyst Mara Gay is here. And lucky for us, former Republican congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly stuck around, and Claire McCaskill did as well. Jacob Soboroff, I come to you first. What are you seeing and hearing?
Nicole, I'm probably about 10, 15, 20 yards at the most from J.D. Vance right now, who's over in the Ohio delegation, getting ready to accept the nomination as former President Trump's vice presidential running mate. We last heard from him quite outspoken, speaking out against the Biden administration, quite frankly, in the wake of the assassination attempt on former President Trump's life. People here are excited, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. He's a young man, 39 years old. He's a millennial from a generation born in the 1980s at the oldest. He and Vice President Kamala Harris represent a new generation of American politics, but I think that's about where the similarities end. He's, of course, if anybody's read Hillbilly Elegy, from a family that has suffered, like so many across the country, from overdose and addiction within his family. That nomination is happening right now. But if you listen to him talk closely, his solutions for these problems are related to immigration. They're not related to the substance abuse disorder that so many people are talking about. And that's why President Biden, is talking about him as an extreme MAGA Republican. I'm going to let everybody hear from him and from the folks up here in just a little bit. But I have to tell you, it was unexpected, I think. He was in the mix. But today, a lot of people were surprised that it ended up being J.D. Vance from the state of Ohio. We're going to wait right here, Nicole. We're going to see if we can try to catch him on his way out. And if that happens, it'll happen in just a couple of minutes. Nicole?
Jacob, are the folks there sort of aware of some of the things that Fox's own Bret Baier has confronted J.D. Vance with in the most generous terms? Bret Baier describing it as an evolution, that he called Donald Trump a cynical a-hole, cultural heroine, and America's Hitler?
Yeah, he also called him an idiot, Nicole, and I think that vociferous opposition to former President Trump is going to be something that J.D. Vance will have to answer for. And, of course, I'm sure he's prepared to answer those questions. He wasn't picked by former President Trump because of an inability to answer those questions. They've certainly reconciled. They've come together on issues like manufacturing and the decimation of the Rust Belt. But like I said, their solutions, those solutions to those issues are ones that the Democratic Party certainly view as extremist MAGA policies, and that's, I think, ultimately we're now seeing the setup of what that debate is going to look like. And that's the nomination. Let's take a quick listen.
Sure.
No no's.
And the motion is adopted.
The ayes have it. The motion's adopted. J.D. Vance is now the official nominee of the Republican Party to be the vice presidential candidate alongside Donald Trump. And now the debate over policy begins, Nicole, including some of those issues that you mentioned very clearly, his vociferous opposition to Donald Trump when Donald Trump was a nascent candidate for president of the United States.
Basil Smikle, your thoughts as you watch this?
Well, you know, the word that I think some people will say is that he has evolved in his positions. I mean, he changed his mind. plain and simple. And he changed his mind out of political expediency. This is a man who raised money for January 6th defendants. I mean, let's be very clear that what Donald Trump, there was a statement that, this might have been a surprise, but, if Donald Trump was looking for somebody that was A, conservative, B, represented the state of Ohio, in thinking that maybe that would help him in some of those other states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and someone who was very, very, very quick to blame Joe Biden for the shooting right after the assassination attempt. And to me, that signaled this is a man that has Donald Trump's back no matter what. And if Donald Trump had seen that, weeks ago or felt that weeks ago, there was no doubt in my mind that this was going to be the kind of person he would choose, but certainly the person he was going to choose, now that we know.
David Jolly, there's something so normal about the stagecraft of a convention, any party's convention, that's so jarring against the backdrop of the moment.
It is. Look, for J.D. Vance, I think he's where Marco Rubio was 15 years ago, which is on the leading edge of the Republican political trend. It's just very different. Marco Rubio is on the leading edge of the Tea Party movement, and let's eliminate cabinet departments and lower taxes, less regulation, all that stuff, with kind of the hard right edge. J.D. Vance is on the leading edge of where Donald Trump has delivered this party 8 years after coming down the elevator. And I think what is most shocking about this convention to me, there's kind of the suspension of reality that we are now here 8 years later, that of all the conventions you and I have probably been to, there used to be platforms with policies that at least made sense in the conservative world. What is remarkable about this convention is what it's devoid of, because it's been replaced with this cult of personality that allows a J.D. Vance to move in through nothing more than through loyalty, blind loyalty, if you will, to Donald Trump and Trumpism. And I think that will be the theme of this entire convention. It's a weird moment in Republican history.
Claire?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about whether conventions should even continue. They're expensive.
Well, we didn't have them 4 years ago.
Yes, we did not have them 4 years ago. And, I've been to my share. And I maybe would put myself in that camp of why do we have them. And this was, by acclamation. There was no discussion. The platform does not reflect this candidate's view on abortion because Donald Trump had the platform changed in the most cynical move you could possibly imagine after he delivers a death knell to essential women's freedoms in this country, him personally doing it, wanting to do it, campaigning on doing, bragging about doing it. Now he wants to soften the platform. So it is really interesting to me that this party is, you're not going to see the Republicans featured on the dais that the old Republican Party would feature. You're not going to see someone who stands up for Ukraine on that dais. This is a guy who fought Mitch McConnell over aid to Ukraine. This is a guy who wants us to be an isolationist country. That wasn't the Republican Party platform that you knew when you were involved in Republican politics. So there won't be anybody on that dais that is about capitalism, free trade, leading the world, voice of freedom, setting an example for the rest of the world. It's going to be about isolationism. It's going to be about cultural issues. And that's not the Republican Party that a lot of Republicans are comfortable with.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.